When I tied the silk blindfold around my eyes that evening, my hands trembled, not from nerves, but from the faint, foolish hope that maybe this time, something would change. That maybe he'd feel something again. That maybe I'd feel something again. I had set the scene carefully, candles flickering along the mantel, soft jazz humming from the corner speaker, the scent of sandalwood curling in the air like an invitation. I had followed every article, every Save Your Marriage blog post that told me to bring back intimacy. I even wore the lingerie he once bought me years ago, tag still on. I waited in silence, breathing shallowly, listening to every sound in the house. And then I heard the door creak. Heavy footsteps. Someone entered the room. I reached out my hand and felt the warmth of skin brush against mine. No words. Just presence. I whispered his name, softly, no answer. But his hands found my waist like they remembered me. He knew exactly how to touch me. It felt too perfect. Too attentive. My heart fluttered, but I silenced the fear. I wanted to believe. I needed to. The next morning, when I woke up, the bed was empty. I peeled off the blindfold and called his name. No response. Hours later, when he returned home with grocery bags, he casually said he'd stayed the night at his brother's. I smiled and nodded, but something in me shattered. My fingertips still remembered the hands from last night, and they weren't his. That was the moment I realized someone else had been in my bed. And the most terrifying part? I hadn't stopped them. Let me tell you everything, from the beginning. Before the shame, before the unraveling, before the moment I lost myself. And before you judge me, ask yourself, have you ever wanted something so desperately that you ignored every sign telling you it was wrong? I always believed marriages didn't fail overnight. They died slowly, like houseplants neglected in a corner, leaves yellowing one by one, unnoticed until the whole thing was brittle and dry. That's how it was with us. Not loud fights or slammed doors. Just silence. Polite nods. Muted routines. And an ache inside me that I never admitted aloud. He was a good man. People always said that. Hardworking. Reliable. The kind of man who paid bills on time and remembered to change the car oil. But he had grown distant. Not cruel, just absent. I'd wake up and find the coffee already made, my cup poured, but he'd be halfway out the door. At dinner, he stared at the TV instead of me. In bed, he turned to the wall. Some nights I'd sit on the edge of the bathtub, robe hanging loose, and stare at myself in the mirror. I still had softness in my curves, still caught glances from strangers at the grocery store. But in his eyes? I was invisible. It didn't happen all at once. It crept in like fog. And then one day I realized I couldn't remember the last time he'd touched me just to feel close. I didn't blame him entirely. I had changed too. Age softened me, but it also silenced me. I didn't ask for what I needed anymore. I just waited. And waited. Until one day, I stopped believing it would come. That's when I started reading those articles. 10 Ways to Rekindle Intimacy. Blindfolded Bonding, the surprise that could save your marriage. It sounded ridiculous. But the idea stayed with me. Maybe if he couldn't see me, if he just felt me, he might remember the woman he once wanted. I spent the entire day preparing. I cleaned the house, cooked his favorite meal, lit candles in every room. I even sprayed the perfume he used to say reminded him of when we first met. I left him a note on the kitchen table, * come upstairs. Don't ask. Just trust me. Wear the blindfold. I'll be waiting, *. I tied it loosely across my eyes and lay back against the pillows. Every creak of the floorboards made my breath hitch. Then, I heard steps. Firm, steady. The door opened. I smiled and whispered his name. He didn't respond. But I felt the weight on the bed. A hand brushed my arm. Then my waist. Fingers traced along the curve of my side, like he remembered every inch. No words were spoken. Just the rhythm of breath, the soft rustle of sheets, and the warmth of skin against mine. He didn't kiss me. He didn't need to. His hands said everything. When it was over, I reached out, but he was already gone. The door closed softly behind him. I untied the blindfold. The candles were still burning. The room smelled like sandalwood and faint sweat. My body hummed with energy I hadn't felt in years. I smiled into the dark. But he didn't come back. Morning came and the house was silent. I made coffee and waited. Finally, the front door opened. He walked in casually, grocery bags in his hands, keys jingling like any other Saturday. "You went out?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. He looked at me strangely. "Yeah. I stayed at Tom's." His back went out again. Helped him with some stuff. Something inside me froze. I forced a nod and turned away before he could see my face. I replayed everything. His hands. The silence. The scent of his cologne, or was it different? The way he hadn't said a word. I wanted to ask him directly, but how could I? "Did you touch me last night?" If he said yes, I'd feel betrayed by the lie. If he said no, I didn't know which answer I feared more. Later that day, I stripped the bed and noticed something strange. A dark thread on the pillow, too short to be mine. And the faintest trace of unfamiliar cologne on the sheets. Not his usual crisp cedar. This was warmer, smokier. My heart thundered. I opened my closet and saw the blindfold hanging exactly where I'd left it, the knot still tied. I sat on the floor and stared at it, my stomach knotting with dread. Who had come into my room? And worse, why had I let them? That night, I barely slept. I watched him across the dinner table as he ate, unaware. He didn't touch me. Didn't mention the note. Didn't act like anything had happened. Maybe it hadn't. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew better. My body knew better. And deep down, a voice whispered a truth I couldn't unhear. If that wasn't my husband in the room with me, then someone had taken his place. And I had let them in. The next morning, I watched him move around the kitchen like everything was normal. He was humming softly under his breath while preparing coffee, his back turned to me, his posture relaxed. I studied him, looking for tension in his shoulders, a stiffness in his voice, any sign that he knew. But there was nothing. Just the clinking of cups, the smell of fresh coffee, and that maddening calmness. He glanced over his shoulder, smiled politely, and said, "You want your usual?" I nodded without speaking. My throat was tight, my skin prickled with unease. He slid the cup toward me on the counter. I reached for it, but my hand trembled, and I spilled a few drops. He didn't seem to notice. The silence between us was heavy. Not the comfortable kind that old couples share, the kind that holds questions no one dares to ask. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but what could I even say? "Did you come into our bedroom last night and touch me without a word?" The very idea made my stomach churn. What if he said no? I excused myself and went upstairs, unable to sit still any longer. I needed air. I needed clarity. But as I reached the top of the stairs, the doorbell rang. It was him. My stepson. He stood there with that same calm composure he always carried, too polite, too poised for someone his age. His eyes flicked past me for a brief second, then returned with a faint, unreadable smile. Just dropping by, he said, holding up a paper bag. Thought you might want some of those croissants from that bakery you like. They were doing a morning batch. It was so casual, so absurdly normal that it felt almost cruel. I hesitated, then stepped aside. He walked in like he belonged there. My husband had already retreated to the garage, probably tinkering with tools or avoiding conversation. I stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, watching him unpack the bag. He moved with a deliberate slowness, each motion careful, intentional. He knew. I could feel it. There was something in his gaze, too steady, too familiar, like he was waiting for me to say something. I didn't. He poured himself a glass of orange juice and leaned against the counter. Nice evening last night? My breath caught. The words were casual, offhand, but his tone, there was something in it, something sharp, concealed beneath the softness. I turned away. We didn't talk much. He chuckled softly behind me. No need for words, I suppose. My spine stiffened. The silence stretched. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. Then I felt it, the shift in the room, the air growing heavier. I turned to look at him, and he was already close. Too close. I opened my mouth, but no sound came. He reached out, gently brushed a strand of hair from my cheek, his fingers barely grazing my skin. We kissed. It was brief, shocking, and I pulled away instantly. My whole body went rigid. I stumbled back, knocking into the table, breath short, vision blurring. My hands flew to my mouth. He didn't move. Didn't apologize. Just looked at me with that same unreadable expression. Are you okay? He asked quietly, like it was a genuine question. I stared at him, my throat dry. Every part of me screamed confusion, guilt, and something worse, something I didn't want to name. He stepped back, giving me space. I should go, he said, as if he'd merely overstayed his welcome. I didn't respond. I couldn't. He walked out, closing the door behind him softly, like nothing had happened. I stood there for a long time, staring at the place where he'd just been. My fingers still tingled. My heart still raced. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, a moment of madness, but the truth was Messier. I hadn't stopped him soon enough. I hadn't pushed him away. Not when I could have. And the worst part? I had felt something. Later that afternoon, I sat alone in the living room, blinds drawn, the croissants untouched on the table. My husband came in, wiping grease off his hands. He looked around briefly, noted the silence, then shrugged. Everything okay? He asked, already halfway through the room. Fine, I lied. He disappeared upstairs, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the carpet. I stared at the blank television screen, my reflection faintly visible in the black surface. I didn't recognize the woman staring back. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, watching the shadows shift across the ceiling. Every sound in the house, a creaking floorboard, the hum of the fridge, made me flinch. I thought of the kiss. The way he had looked at me. The way I hadn't pulled away fast enough. The way my lips had remembered. I pressed my hand to my chest, trying to calm the tremors. This couldn't continue. I had to do something. I had to talk to someone. But who could I possibly tell? I considered calling my sister. Or maybe that friend from work, the one who always seemed to know what to do. But even the thought of speaking these words aloud made me nauseous. Instead, I went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. The woman in the mirror stared back with haunted eyes. Lines I hadn't noticed before etched around her mouth and forehead. Not from age, from weight. Emotional weight. Secrets. I dried my face and leaned against the counter, whispering to the quiet room, "What have I done?" But the room offered no answers. In the days that followed, I kept my distance. I didn't answer his messages, didn't return his call when he rang once. I tried to act normal around my husband, but the effort left me exhausted. Every interaction felt like a performance. Every smile, rehearsed. And yet, under it all, something else was growing. Not desire. Not guilt. Something worse. Curiosity. Who was he, really? Why had he done it? Was it a game? A mistake? Or something deliberate? I didn't know. All I knew was that the line had been crossed. And there was no going back. The following days passed with a strange kind of stillness, as if the air around me had thickened. I moved through the house like a ghost, completing tasks automatically, folding laundry, watering plants, wiping down counters that weren't dirty. Everything felt like a performance to convince myself that life hadn't changed, even though I knew it had. My husband noticed nothing. Or pretended to. He continued his routines without comment, ate meals silently, barely looked up from his phone or the newspaper. Once, I caught him glancing at me across the dinner table, and for a moment I thought he might say something. But he didn't. He just cleared his throat and asked if we were out of orange juice. That was the extent of our intimacy now, inventory checks and logistical coordination. I wondered if he could sense what was unraveling inside me. Or maybe he simply didn't care anymore. I couldn't tell which possibility hurt more. The kiss with my stepson haunted me, not just for what it meant but for how it made me feel. I tried to convince myself it was just shock, a momentary lapse, but that wasn't true. There had been a flicker inside me, recognition, electricity. And it wasn't just about him. It was about me. About feeling seen, noticed, wanted. Something I hadn't experienced in so long I'd forgotten how it felt. But I was also horrified. Not just by the act itself, but by the way it had lingered in me afterward. Like a seed planted too deep to remove. One morning, I found myself scrolling through my messages, debating whether to delete his number. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I didn't press it. Instead, I set the phone down and went to the kitchen to make tea. When the doorbell rang, my body froze. I wasn't expecting anyone. My first instinct was to ignore it, pretend I wasn't home. But I walked to the door anyway and opened it before I could change my mind. It wasn't him. It was his aunt, my husband's sister. She stood there with her arms crossed, wearing that same judgmental expression she always had when addressing me. Her tone was flat. I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd check in. I forced a smile and stepped aside, letting her in. She made herself comfortable in the living room, commenting on how quiet the house felt. I poured her coffee, listened as she made passive remarks about my husband's apparent withdrawal from the family, and nodded in all the right places. Then her voice shifted. "Heard from him lately?" My stomach flipped. I looked at her, trying to keep my face neutral. "Who?" "His son." I took a long sip of tea. "No." "Why?" She tilted her head, studying me. "Just curious." "He's been around." "More than usual." I didn't respond. I stared into my mug, watching the steam rise. She didn't press further, but I could feel the tension in the room like a wire stretched taut between us. After she left, I sat alone on the couch for a long time. The silence pressed in around me again, but this time it wasn't comforting. It felt like a warning. That evening, I told my husband I was thinking of taking a short trip, just a weekend away, somewhere quiet. I expected resistance, suspicion maybe. But all he said was, "Do what you need to do." His indifference stung more than any accusation would have. I booked a small cabin near the lake, one we had visited years ago during better times. I told myself I needed space, clarity, distance. And maybe I did. But beneath that rationalization was something else, a need to breathe somewhere he hadn't touched, somewhere new. I packed lightly. A few clothes, a book I knew I wouldn't read, and a notebook I hadn't opened in years. The drive there was uneventful. The road twisted through thick woods, the sky overcast, the wind gusting against the windshield. I didn't play music. I wanted the silence. The cabin was just as I remembered, wooden, simple, tucked between tall pines. It smelled faintly of pine and old fabric. I unpacked, made tea, and sat on the small porch with a blanket draped around my shoulders. That night, I barely slept. My mind raced with possibilities, memories, doubts. The kiss. The blindfolded night. The silence at home. It all felt like fragments of a puzzle I couldn't assemble. In the morning, I went for a walk along the water. The lake was still, glassy, reflecting the gray sky above. I felt a strange peace there, like the world had paused just for me. I wanted to stay in that moment, stretch it out until everything else dissolved. But when I returned to the cabin, a car was parked in the gravel driveway. My heart dropped. I approached slowly, cautiously. He was sitting on the steps, a paper bag beside him. He looked up when he saw me, his expression unreadable. "I brought breakfast," he said. I didn't respond. I walked past him, unlocked the door, and went inside. He followed a few moments later, setting the bag on the table. I stood near the sink, arms crossed, unsure of what to say. "You told him you were coming here?" I asked. "No," he said. "I heard you mention this place once." Took a guess. I turned to face him. "You shouldn't be here." "I know." But he didn't leave. He sat down, opened the bag, and took out 2 pastries. Set one on a napkin in front of me like it was a normal morning. The silence between us stretched. Finally, I sat down across from him. "Why?" I asked. He didn't pretend not to understand. "Because I needed you to see me," he said. "Not just as someone's son. Not just as a reminder of your marriage. As me." I stared at him, my fingers curling into fists. "You crossed a line." "So did you." I didn't deny it. I couldn't. We sat there in the silence, pastries cooling between us, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down like a stone. I didn't ask him to leave. And he didn't offer to go. After he left the cabin, I stood at the door for a long time, hand resting on the frame, unsure whether I had just made a mistake by letting him in, or by letting him leave. The silence that followed his departure was different this time. It wasn't peaceful or clarifying. It pulsed with everything we hadn't said, everything we had crossed into without a plan of return. I stared at the untouched pastry on the table and then threw it in the trash. That morning, I walked farther than usual, letting my boots crunch against the gravel road, the cold air cutting through my jacket. I needed the sharpness. I needed something to pierce through the confusion that had layered itself like fog in my mind. There was no comfort in solitude anymore, only echoing thoughts that refused to settle. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun had reached its peak. The interior felt smaller than before, as if it had absorbed the energy of what had happened inside it. I couldn't sit still. I tidied the place, folded clothes that didn't need folding, arranged dishes by size and color, even wiped the already clean counters. None of it helped. Eventually, I took out the notebook I had packed. It was old, the spine soft and curved from years of sitting untouched in a drawer. I opened it to a blank page and began writing, not to confess, not to make sense of anything, but just to get it out. The words came slowly at first, like pulling threads from tangled cloth. Then faster, as if some dam had broken. I wrote about the blindfold. The night I thought I was saving my marriage. How I let someone into my body without even knowing who they were. How I told myself it was him because it had to be. How I buried every instinct that told me something was off. I wrote about the kiss in the kitchen. The confusion. The flicker of desire I hadn't expected. The breakfast at the cabin. The way he said he wanted me to see him. But see what, exactly? I closed the notebook before I could answer that. That evening, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared out the window at the lake. The water was silver in the dying light, unmoving, like it had turned to glass. I watched it until darkness swallowed the shore and the trees blurred into shadow. When I returned home the next day, the house felt colder. My husband was in the garage, as usual. The faint sound of a wrench clinking against metal echoed through the walls. I put my bag down, went upstairs, and unpacked in silence. I didn't tell him I had gone. I didn't explain anything. And he didn't ask. That was the nature of us now, parallel lives that no longer intersected. At dinner, we sat across from each other like business associates sharing a table out of obligation. I tried to look at him and remember who we had been. There had been love, once. Laughter, touch, even long walks where we spoke about nothing for hours. But now, I couldn't find a trace of that. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, listening to the rhythm of his breath, I realized I hadn't touched him in months. Not his hand, not his shoulder, not even a brush of skin during conversation. We had become strangers under the same roof. He shifted in his sleep, turning away from me. I turned in the opposite direction. The next morning, I drove to the store to buy groceries. As I loaded paper bags into the trunk, I caught a glimpse of someone across the parking lot. Tall, dark jacket, familiar walk. My breath caught before I realized it wasn't him. Just a stranger. My body betrayed me in that moment, my pulse racing, my mind momentarily flooded with irrational thoughts. I hated that I noticed. Back at home, I unpacked the groceries in silence. I moved slower than usual, tired from the weight I carried inside. My phone buzzed on the counter. A single message. Asterisk, are you okay? Asterisk. It was from him. I stared at it, thumb hovering above the screen. I didn't answer. I deleted the message, then turned the phone off and shoved it into a drawer. Later that week, I went through old photo albums. Dusty covers, faded corners. Pages filled with smiles and summer vacations and family dinners. I found one of us, taken on a trip to the mountains, years ago. We were laughing, arms around each other, faces close. I studied that version of myself. There was light in her eyes. Confidence in her posture. She looked like someone who believed in being loved. I didn't recognize her anymore. And then I found a photo of him as a child, my stepson, no older than 10, standing beside his father. His eyes were bright, his smile wide. There was admiration in the way he looked at the man beside him. I closed the album and set it aside, suddenly sick with the knowledge of how much had been lost. Of how something had shifted in all of us, somewhere along the way. I wondered if that little boy in the photo would recognize the man he had become. I wasn't sure I did. That weekend, I told my husband I was going to visit a friend. He nodded, distracted by a tool catalog in his hands, and said nothing more. I packed an overnight bag but had no destination in mind. I drove aimlessly for hours, letting the highway pull me farther away from home. Eventually, I found myself parked outside a hotel off the interstate. Nothing special. Just a place to disappear for a night. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the entrance, engine running. I didn't go inside. Instead, I drove back home, arriving well after dark. The house was quiet. He was already asleep. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, staring out the window at the night. My reflection hovered faintly in the glass, overlaid on the blackness outside. I looked tired. Older than I remembered. But there was something else in my eyes too, something I couldn't quite name. Not regret. Not guilt. Just silence. The kind that comes after a storm, when you're not sure whether it's truly over or if the worst is still ahead. I sipped the tea, let it scald my tongue. And waited. The following week unfolded like a quiet unraveling. Each day brought with it a strange mix of normalcy and unease, like living in a house with a crack in the foundation that no one wanted to acknowledge. My husband continued about his routine as though we were still tethered to one another, but the truth was evident in the things we didn't say, the way our hands never brushed anymore, the hollow spaces in our conversations that used to be filled with laughter or affection. One morning, I sat at the kitchen table watching the steam rise from my mug. The air was still, thick with the weight of things unsaid. My phone sat face down beside me, silent and untouched. I hadn't responded to his message. I didn't know what I would say if I did. I spent more time outside than usual, walking through the neighborhood, sometimes sitting on the back porch in silence, letting the wind move around me. The autumn air had shifted, cooler now, carrying the scent of dry leaves and distant fireplaces. I wrapped myself in layers and sat with my thoughts, trying to make sense of who I had become. The woman I was now didn't align with the one I had tried so hard to be for so long. I wasn't sure if I resented the change or welcomed it. A few days later, I received another message. No words this time, just a photo. A lake. The same one near the cabin. The water was still, the sky overcast. I stared at it for a long time before locking my phone and slipping it into a drawer. But the image lingered. Later that afternoon, I found myself in the laundry room, folding clothes that didn't need folding. My husband came in, looked around for a moment, and then asked if I'd seen his black jacket. I told him it was hanging in the hall closet. He nodded, then stood there awkwardly, like he wanted to say something but didn't know how to begin. You seem distracted lately, he said finally. I met his gaze. It had been a while since he looked at me directly like that. I've had a lot on my mind, I replied. He didn't ask what. Instead, he nodded and left the room. That was the extent of our intimacy now, acknowledging each other's absences without the courage to fill them. That evening, I found myself back in the guest room. I told him I needed space. He didn't argue. The next day, I ran errands. Groceries. Gas. Picked up dry cleaning. Tasks that gave me the illusion of movement. When I returned home, I saw his car parked down the street. Not my husband's, his. My pulse spiked as I pulled into the driveway, trying to keep my face neutral in case anyone was watching. I stepped inside and found him sitting at the kitchen table, legs crossed, a glass of water in front of him like he belonged there. I was in the area, he said, as if it explained everything. I stood frozen in the entryway, keys still in my hand. My eyes scanned his face, looking for a sign, remorse, defiance, anything. But he was calm, steady, too familiar. You shouldn't be here, I said quietly. Maybe not, he replied. But I'm here. I set the keys down, took off my coat, and slowly walked past him into the living room. I didn't ask why he came. I didn't need to. He followed me without a word, sitting on the edge of the armchair like a guest waiting for permission to stay. We sat in silence for a while. I stared at the window, at the bare trees outside, their branches clawing at the sky. He sat across from me, not speaking, not moving, just watching. Finally, I broke the silence. "You think I don't see what this is?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't flinch. "What do you see?" I shook my head. "I see someone trying to make sense of his pain by passing it on." He exhaled slowly, almost like a laugh. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just trying to find a place in something that was never mine." I looked at him then, really looked. He wasn't cruel. Not angry. Just fractured. Like something had been broken in him long before I ever stepped into the picture. We didn't speak again for several minutes. Then he stood up, walked over to me, and paused. He didn't touch me. He didn't need to. We kissed. It was quiet, brief, and deeply wrong. And I let it happen. He left without another word. I didn't follow him. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the echo of the kiss still burning on my lips. My husband was in the next room, asleep, unaware. Or perhaps not. Perhaps he knew more than he let on. Perhaps silence was his way of keeping the ground beneath him from cracking open. I kept thinking about that question, what do I see? I saw a marriage that had dissolved so gradually, we didn't even notice. I saw a young man carrying the weight of abandonment like a badge. I saw myself, desperate to feel something again, anything that reminded me I was alive. But I didn't see a way back. The next morning, the house was too quiet. I wandered from room to room, touching surfaces as if trying to remember what each space had once meant to me. The bedroom. The hallway. The photos on the wall. They felt like props now. Familiar, but no longer sacred. I opened the blinds in the living room and watched the street outside. People walking dogs. Kids riding bikes. A woman pushing a stroller. Lives in motion, untouched by the storm swirling inside my home. Inside me. I made a pot of coffee. Sat on the porch with a blanket over my legs. I sipped slowly, staring at the sky, unsure whether it was about to rain or clear. Somewhere inside me, something had shifted again. Not a decision. Not yet. But a realization. There would be no simple end to this. No clear resolution. No moment where everything fell into place. Life didn't work like that. People didn't. I had crossed a line. Not just once, but repeatedly. And now I was somewhere in between, between truth and denial, guilt and justification, ending and continuation. I didn't know where it would lead. But I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. Not to him. Not to myself. Not even to the mirror. I began waking up earlier than usual, before the alarm, before the light seeped through the curtains. The silence at that hour was different, emptier, somehow more honest. There were no distractions, no performances to maintain. Just me and the quiet weight of knowing. I would sit on the edge of the bed for a long time, sometimes without even moving, staring at the pattern on the floor or the outline of my slippers in the shadows. The rest of the house slept, unaware. Or maybe it didn't care anymore. Routine became my shield. I cleaned meticulously. I cooked meals no one complimented. I folded laundry that no one noticed. I answered my husband's practical questions with practical answers. No one asked anything deeper, and I didn't offer. It was easier that way. The surface remained undisturbed while the current beneath grew more violent. One afternoon, I went through the garage looking for a box of old winter clothes. My husband wasn't home, and I wanted to stay occupied. As I dug through shelves and containers, I came across a small stack of photo frames wrapped in newspaper. I hadn't seen them in years. I unwrapped one, and there we were, our wedding day. Smiling, eyes bright, cheeks flushed with happiness and certainty. I stared at that version of myself for a long time, wondering what she would think if she could see me now. Would she recognize me at all? I left the frame on the workbench and walked out without saying anything. That evening, as I was setting the table, my husband came home later than usual. He looked tired, older than I remembered, as if he, too, had been carrying something he refused to name. He sat down without a word, glanced at the food, and offered a quiet thanks. We ate mostly in silence, the occasional clink of fork against plate the only sound. Halfway through the meal, he set his utensils down and looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" he asked, not with suspicion but with something closer to fatigue. Or maybe resignation. I nodded. "I'm fine." He waited, then nodded back. That was the end of it. He didn't push. I didn't explain. The wall between us held. Later that night, I heard a knock on the front door. It was soft, almost tentative, but distinct. I paused, unsure whether I had imagined it. My husband was already asleep. I tiptoed downstairs, heart thudding in my chest. When I opened the door, he stood there, my stepson, hands in his pockets, eyes cast slightly downward like he wasn't sure if I'd let him in. I didn't say anything. I just stepped aside. He walked in quietly, and we stood in the hallway for a long moment, the air between us taut. I could hear the ticking of the kitchen clock from the next room. We didn't move. We didn't speak. I led him to the back porch, where the light was dim and the air crisp. We sat side by side on the bench, our shoulders close but not touching. I could feel the warmth radiating off him. My fingers gripped the edges of the bench as if letting go might unravel everything. "I thought about not coming," he said after a long pause. "I thought about not opening the door." Silence. "I never meant to hurt you," he continued. "Or to confuse you. I just didn't know what else to do with everything I was feeling." I stared straight ahead. "I think we both stopped knowing what we were doing a long time ago." He nodded slowly, then exhaled. "It's strange, isn't it? How people can live together, share a house, a name, a bed, and still feel like strangers." My throat tightened. I didn't trust myself to speak. He wasn't just talking about us. He was talking about his father. About me. About the space between people that sometimes grows so slowly you don't notice it until it's too wide to bridge. We sat there until the cold began to settle into our bones. Then I stood. "You should go," I said softly. He stood too, nodding without protest. As he reached the door, he turned and looked at me. "I don't regret seeing you," he said. "But I'll stay away if that's what you want." I didn't respond. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a long time. The next morning, my husband asked if I wanted to go away for the weekend. It was so out of character that I paused mid-step, unsure I had heard him correctly. I asked him what brought it on. "We haven't had time together in a while," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Figured it wouldn't hurt." I agreed. Not because I wanted to go, but because I didn't know what else to say. A weekend away might not change anything, but it might remind us who we once were, or confirm that we had drifted too far from it. We packed light, drove in silence, stayed at a small inn we had visited early in our marriage. The familiarity of it unsettled me. The same creaky floors. The same faded wallpaper. The same window view of the lake. That evening, as we sat by the fireplace in the common room, he reached over and took my hand. I didn't pull away. It was the first time in months he had touched me without obligation. We kissed. It was gentle, almost cautious, like we were trying to see if the past could be resurrected with one small gesture. It couldn't. But it lingered. Back in our room, we didn't say much. We lay in the same bed, our bodies still separated by invisible walls, but something had shifted, if only slightly. I stared at the ceiling until I fell asleep. The following morning, we drove home under a heavy sky. Rain threatened but never came. The silence between us was softer this time, less like avoidance and more like agreement. We had tried. That night, as I unpacked our things, I found an old note he had written me tucked into one of the bags. It was brief. A few words. I know I haven't been easy to live with. I'm sorry. I'm trying. I held the paper in my hands for a long time. Then folded it, placed it in the back of my drawer, and turned out the light. I had always believed that certain moments left marks on us, some visible, others buried so deeply they only surfaced in quiet hours, like echoes in an empty house. When we returned from that brief weekend away, I kept waiting to feel something shift inside me. A thawing. A softening. Maybe even a quiet reconciliation with the life I had built. But what I felt instead was silence. Not peace, just the kind of silence that follows an apology you're not sure you can accept, and a truth you haven't yet dared to face. The house greeted us the way it always did, still, stale, untouched. I moved through it like someone stepping into a memory, unsure whether to inhabit it or mourn it. The familiarity of everything felt wrong, somehow too small, like I had outgrown the rooms without realizing it. I spent the next few days attempting to maintain the illusion that our weekend had meant something. I cooked meals with more care, kept the conversation light, tried to hold eye contact a little longer. But under the surface, my thoughts returned again and again to what hadn't been said, to the space that still stretched between us. I noticed how often we talked around things, not through them. How neither of us asked questions we didn't want answered. The morning he left for a work trip, I stood at the window watching his car disappear down the street. The silence in the house returned like a tide. I didn't fight it. I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the edge of the couch, hands wrapped around the mug, staring at the hardwood floor. The message I had been avoiding appeared in my thoughts again, his voice, his eyes, that quiet sentence on the porch, "I'll stay away if that's what you want." I hadn't replied. I hadn't needed to. But his absence was a presence of its own. By the afternoon, I found myself sitting in the car, parked in front of the lake where we had once spoken. The water was still again, the sky hanging low with clouds. I watched the breeze ripple across the surface like fingers dragging through fabric. The wind picked up slightly, brushing strands of hair against my face. I didn't get out of the car. Instead, I drove. Not home. Not anywhere in particular. Just roads I hadn't traveled in years. Streets that once meant something. I passed by the diner we used to visit on Sunday mornings, the bookstore where we had bought our first shared copy of a novel we never finished. I drove past the old apartment building where we lived before we could afford the mortgage, before everything settled into routine. Eventually, I pulled into a small park and turned off the engine. The quiet pressed in around me. I rolled down the window and listened to the wind stirring the trees. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry or sad. I felt suspended. Like I was waiting for something to catch me or break me. When I returned home that evening, the house felt colder than usual. I stepped inside, dropped my keys on the table, and stood in the entryway. Everything was in place, shoes lined neatly, lights dim, the faint scent of lavender from a diffuser in the corner. But I wasn't alone. I didn't hear the door open. I didn't hear footsteps. He was already there when I entered the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch, as if he'd been waiting for hours. He didn't look surprised to see me. Only patient. My heart didn't race. My breath didn't catch. There was no dramatic moment of realization. Just the slow understanding that this was always going to happen, eventually. I set my bag down and sat across from him, knees close to the edge of my seat. I told myself I wouldn't come back, he said. And yet here you are, I replied. He nodded. You didn't answer me. But you didn't say no either. I looked away, eyes landing on the framed photo of our family still perched on the mantel. Smiles frozen in time. A portrait of something that had already begun to fray before the shutter clicked. You're not here because of me, I said, my voice quiet. You're here because of him. I'm here because of everything, he said. Because of what I lost. What he took. And maybe what I thought I could reclaim. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to defend. We sat in silence. The space between us felt thick, almost alive. Everything I hadn't said boiled inside my chest, pushing at my ribs, but I kept it contained. I used to think, he began again, that if I could just make you feel what she felt, my mother, that it would make it even. That watching someone else lose what mattered to them would balance the scale. And does it? I asked. He shook his head. No. It doesn't feel like justice. Just another wound. I pressed my hands together, fingers tight. What do you want from me? I asked, not accusing, just tired. I don't know anymore. We both sat still. The clock on the wall ticked, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The world carried on outside, oblivious. I can't fix what he did to her, I said finally. I didn't break that. No, he agreed. But you stood where she should have stood. The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were unfair, but because they were true. I had never thought of it that way. I was always so focused on what was missing in my own life, I hadn't considered the space I had taken up in someone else's. He stood then, slowly, as if lifting the weight of everything he'd said. He walked to the door, his hand resting on the knob for a moment. Then he turned to me. We spent the night together. The words came without bitterness. Just fact. I didn't answer. I didn't move. And then he left. The silence that followed was different this time. Not emptier. Just final. I sat alone in that room for a long time. Not thinking. Not planning. Just feeling the echo of what had been said. It wasn't closure. But it was something. In the days that followed his departure, the house became unbearably quiet again, as though it had absorbed every word we exchanged and was now holding its breath. I moved through it like someone visiting a place they no longer lived in. My footsteps felt foreign against the floorboards, and even the ticking of the hallway clock had developed a dull, hollow sound. It wasn't grief exactly. It wasn't relief either. It was the strange numbness that comes when you've crossed every line and realize there are no more lines left. I kept thinking about what he said before he left, * we spent the night together, * there had been no anger in it, no demand. Just a truth laid bare between us like a scar, not fresh, not bleeding, but unmistakable. That sentence echoed in the walls of my mind at odd times, while pouring coffee, folding towels, passing the mirror. It lived with me now, not as a secret but as a shadow. My husband returned from his work trip a day early. I heard the front door close and the familiar sound of keys landing in the bowl by the entrance. I was upstairs in the hallway, folding sheets, when I saw him climb the stairs with his overnight bag slung over his shoulder. His eyes landed on me briefly, and for a second, I thought he might say something, ask about how the week had been, how I'd slept, how I was feeling. But he didn't. He just nodded once, walked into the bedroom, and closed the door behind him. I stood there with the folded sheet in my arms, watching the silence reassert itself. Later, we ate dinner in the same room but not truly together. He read from his phone between bites. I watched the shadows dance on the walls, the flicker of candlelight reflected in the silverware. I tried to remember the last time we talked about something that mattered. I couldn't. That night, I sat on the back porch alone. The wind was colder now, biting at my skin even through the blanket draped over my shoulders. I didn't light a candle. I didn't bring a book. I just stared into the dark, listening to the sounds of distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves. The world went on, indifferent. I thought about calling someone, my sister, maybe, or an old friend. But the idea of explaining any of this felt impossible. I wasn't ready for sympathy. Or judgment. Or even support. I didn't want to be absolved. I didn't want to be understood. I wanted stillness. And silence. And maybe, in some small way, punishment. The next morning, I cleaned the guest room. Not just tidied, but stripped it down. Washed every surface. Laundered the sheets twice. Rearranged the books on the shelves. Dusted the corners. I scrubbed until my fingers ached and my knuckles were raw. When I was finished, I sat in the middle of the room, back against the wall, and let myself feel everything I had been avoiding. The shame. The confusion. The longing. The loneliness. All of it piled up like a weight on my chest, and I let it press down without resisting. I didn't cry. There were no tears left for this part of the story. In the following days, I began writing again. Nothing elaborate. Just small fragments in the notebook I had taken to the cabin. Sentences without structure. Thoughts without judgment. Things like, I forgot how to be touched without guilt. He looked at me like I was whole, and that terrified me. Asterisk marriage is not silence. It's learning how to hear each other over the noised asterisk. I still don't know what I was trying to fix. The act of writing helped, not to solve anything, but to anchor me to myself. To remind me that I was still here, however changed. I started leaving the house more. Grocery trips became excuses to linger in the aisles. I went to a bookstore and wandered for an hour without buying anything. I sat alone in a cafe just to listen to strangers talk about lives that didn't include me. My husband noticed the shift. He didn't comment, but I saw it in the way he watched me sometimes, quietly, like he was trying to map a familiar shape that had changed when he wasn't looking. One evening, he made dinner without being asked. When we sat down to eat, the conversation came slowly but felt more real than it had in weeks. He asked about the garden, about the neighbor's dog that kept digging holes along the fence. I answered, careful and measured. When he brought up the possibility of repainting the bedroom, I said we could talk about it. It wasn't a breakthrough. It wasn't even a restart. But it was something. That night, after the dishes were done and the house had quieted, I opened the drawer where I had hidden the old photo of us on our wedding day. I studied our faces again. The optimism. The belief. The way we leaned into each other like there was no other place to be. I didn't recognize those people anymore. But I no longer wanted to erase them either. They were real. They mattered. They were part of the road that brought me here. I set the photo down and looked out the window. Outside, the wind was still. The leaves had stopped falling. There was no clarity waiting at the end of this story, no dramatic revelation, no redemption neatly wrapped in resolution. But there was presence. And in its own way, that was enough for now. I had made choices. Some of them impossible to justify. Others, too complicated to reduce to right or wrong. I wasn't proud of all of them. But they were mine. And I had to live with them. Not by running. Not by forgetting. But by standing in the middle of the life I had built, flawed, unfinished, and entirely mine. It took time, but slowly the sharp edges of everything began to dull. Not disappear. Not resolve. Just soften enough for me to breathe without flinching. The days began to return to some sort of rhythm, not like before, never like before, but steady in a different way. I still moved through the house with care, still felt the occasional tremor of memory brush past me in quiet moments, but I no longer jumped at shadows I'd created. Autumn bled into early winter. The leaves had mostly fallen. The branches outside my window reached upward like thin hands in prayer, stripped of their color, but still standing. I started walking again in the mornings. A quiet neighborhood loop. Just me and the cold. I liked how the chill burned in my lungs. It reminded me that I was still alive. One morning, I passed by the community board posted near the park. It was cluttered with flyers, dog walking, yoga classes, missing cats, local events. My eyes landed on a small note tucked in the corner. A handwritten one. I didn't know why I noticed it, but something about the uneven handwriting caught my attention. Asterisk starting over doesn't mean forgetting. It just means choosing what you carry with you. Asterisk. I stood there longer than I should have, rereading it again and again. I didn't tear it down. I didn't take a photo. I just walked away with the words folded into me. At home, my husband was already in the kitchen, sipping coffee, reading the news. He glanced up when I came in, then offered a quiet, "Morning." I nodded back. The silence between us now wasn't hostile, it was just tired. Like both of us had agreed to put down weapons neither of us had the strength to lift anymore. We functioned. We shared space. We exchanged pleasantries. But the core of us was gone. Not from one moment or betrayal, but from 1,000 missed opportunities to try harder. Later that day, I found myself in the guest room again. I stood in the middle, arms crossed, scanning the walls. It was clean, orderly, untouched. But it held something. Not just memory, but weight. It had become the room where truth echoed the loudest, even in stillness. I opened the drawer of the nightstand and pulled out the notebook again. The one I had started weeks ago. I hadn't touched it in a while. The last sentence written was jagged, half-finished. Asterisk maybe I was never trying to save the marriage. Maybe I was trying to save myself. Asterisk. I stared at it, then pressed the pen to the page. Asterisk, or maybe I was trying to destroy something before it destroyed me. Asterisk. That line sat heavy in the center of the page. I didn't write anything else. The next day, I drove to the cabin. I didn't tell anyone. I just packed a small bag, filled the tank, and went. The road was quiet, winding through trees now mostly bare, their branches clicking softly in the wind. I kept the windows closed, music off, the silence my only companion. When I arrived, the air was colder than I expected. The lake was still, the surface broken only by a pair of distant ducks gliding near the shore. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Everything was as we left it. I didn't touch anything for a while. I just stood there and let the quiet settle around me. Eventually, I built a fire, not out of ceremony, just necessity, and sat near it on the floor. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just let the heat wash over me as the flames rose and curled like breath. At some point, I opened the window, letting the cold air in to balance the heat. The scent of pine and smoke filled the cabin. I closed my eyes and tried to picture my life beyond all of this, beyond the man I married, beyond the man who came back into my life to show me everything I didn't want to see. But my mind was blank. Not in despair. Just in readiness. I didn't stay overnight. I left as the sky began to shift to twilight. I drove slowly, letting the road stretch before me like a question. When I returned home, it was already dark. The porch light was on. I stepped inside quietly. My husband was in the den, watching something on television, the soft flicker of the screen lighting his face in muted flashes. He didn't look up when I entered. I stood behind the couch for a long moment, unsure what I was about to say. I watched the back of his head, the slope of his shoulders, the faint movement of his hand resting on the armrest. He seemed smaller somehow, less imposing than I remembered. Finally, I stepped closer. "We need to talk," I said, my voice even, quiet, but resolute. He muted the TV and turned to face me. His expression didn't change. He nodded once, slowly. I sat down on the other end of the couch, putting space between us but facing him fully. "I'm not happy," I said. "I don't think you are either." He didn't answer right away. Then he nodded again, almost like he had been waiting for me to say it aloud. "I know," he replied. We sat there in silence for what felt like hours, though I knew it was only minutes. There were no accusations. No shouting. No begging. Just the mutual recognition that we had reached the end of a chapter we both had kept pretending was still being written. "I think we stopped being us a long time ago," I said. "I think you're right," he answered. There was sadness in his voice. But not resistance. We didn't make decisions that night. We didn't talk logistics or separation or what would happen next. But we had finally named the truth. And that, in itself, was a beginning. The next morning, I opened the window in the kitchen and let the cold morning air flood in. I made coffee. I sat with a pen and a blank sheet of paper. I didn't know what I would write yet. But I knew the first word. Enough. I stared at it, then underlined it once. It was time.